If someone asked why AstroWorld closed, most people would give a simple answer. Six Flags wanted the land, and the money was too good to pass up. That is true as far as it goes, but the real story stretches across 37 years, and it involves a former mayor who built empires from air conditioning and sheer audacity. The world's first river rapids, ride born right there in Houston. A wooden roller coaster modeled after a Coney Island legend. A parking dispute with a football stadium that became the excuse everyone needed. And a rapper who would give the park an afterlife nobody could have predicted. The closing was not one decision. It was the last in a long sequence of them. Some made in boardrooms in Oklahoma City and New York. Some made by hurricane seasons and shifting demographics. Some made by families who stopped showing up and corporations that stopped investing. To understand any of it, you have to go back to 1960s Houston when the space race was on, and one man looked at a stretch of swampy land south of the Astrodome and saw something that would make children scream with joy for nearly 4 decades. Houston, in 1968, was a city that believed it could do anything. NASA had set up shop at the Johnson Space Center, and the whole region had rebranded itself as Space City. Astronauts trained there. Mission Control operated there. The future was being assembled in the humid air of the Gulf Coast, and everyone wanted a piece of it. The Astrodome had already opened 3 years earlier, and people called it the 8th wonder of the world, because nobody had ever seen a domed stadium before. Nobody had thought to put a roof over a baseball field and fill it with air conditioning until Houston did it. Now something else was rising from the flat, swampy land just south of that dome. If you drove down Loop 610 in 1967, you would have seen the skeleton of it, steel and scaffolding pushing up from terrain that had no business supporting anything. The ground there was wet and prone to flooding. Engineers had to bring in 500,000 cubic yards of fill dirt just to create stable land. The whole complex was called Astrodomain, and it was growing into something sprawling and strange. 116 acres surrounding the dome itself. A convention center called Astro Hall. Hotels with a combined capacity of 5,600 guests. And at the center of all this ambition sat a theme park that would open its gates in June of 1968. The humidity was brutal, and the mosquitoes were relentless, and the land itself seemed to resist development at every turn. It took a particular kind of madness to look at that swamp and see magic. That man was Judge Roy Hofheinz. Roy Hofheinz was not actually a judge in the way most people use the word. He had served as a county judge in Harris County back in the 1930s when he was only 24 years old, the youngest person ever to hold that position. The title stuck for the rest of his life, even as he moved on to become a state legislator, then mayor of Houston, then something harder to define. He was a promoter and a dreamer and a deal maker who operated on a scale that made other ambitious men look timid. In the early 1960s, he had convinced Houston that it needed Major League Baseball, and then convinced Harris County taxpayers to fund a stadium unlike anything the world had seen. The Astrodome was his monument, but it was never going to be enough. What inspired him was a trip to Disneyland, where he watched families spend entire days inside a single property, eating and riding and buying souvenirs, all of it contained and controlled and profitable. He saw what Walt Disney had built in Anaheim, and he saw what Angus Wynne had built with Six Flags Over Texas in Arlington, and he decided Houston deserved something grander than both. Hofheinz hired Harper Goff, a Hollywood set designer who had worked on Disney projects, to help realize his vision. Goff designed a custom railcar for Hofheinz called the AstroDoma that would run on the park's train tracks. The railcar had an office and a wet bar and a marble bathroom and stained glass windows and a pipe organ because Hofheinz did not believe in restraint. He had plans for a monorail that would connect the theme park to the Astrodome and the hotels. Engineers built extra supports into the bridge over Loop 610 to accommodate the beamway. The monorail never came, but the supports are probably still there, holding nothing, waiting for a future that Hofheinz could see but never quite deliver. On June 1, 1968, Judge Roy Hofheinz stood at the gates of his newest creation and could not wait. A reporter from the Houston Post named Frank Davis watched as the Astro Wizard himself unlocked the entrance 15 minutes ahead of schedule because patience had never been one of his virtues. Two of his grandchildren released 2,000 balloons into the humid Houston sky, and 50,000 guests poured through during that first weekend alone. What they found inside was a fantasy divided into 8 themed sections spread across 57 acres. Americana Square offered nostalgia for a simpler time. Oriental Corner transported visitors to an imagined Asia. Plaza de Fiesta celebrated Mexican culture. Children's World catered to the youngest guests. Western Junction recreated the frontier. European Village brought the Old World to the Gulf Coast. Alpine Valley suggested Swiss mountains in the flattest part of Texas. And Maudeville promised the future that Houston was supposedly building. The man who designed all of it was Randall Duell, a Hollywood architect who had worked on The Wizard of Oz and Singin' in the Rain, and would later create Magic Mountain in California. Duell understood spectacle, and Hofheinz demanded nothing less. The judge had boasted that AstroWorld would feature the most extensive outdoor air conditioning system ever attempted, and on opening day, 2,000 tons of cooling power pumped into shaded areas throughout the park. In Houston, where summer feels like breathing through a wet towel, this was not a luxury, but a technological miracle. The world noticed. That Christmas, a BC broadcast a television special called The Pied Piper of AstroWorld, and a 16-year-old dancer named Patrick Swayze appeared in a bear costume years before anyone knew his name. The park was a triumph, and Hofheinz was vindicated, and everything seemed possible. But historians who study his career see the cracks that were already forming beneath the spectacle. He made a lot of money, but he also lost a lot of money. He leveraged every project against every other project. The Astrodome funded AstroWorld, which funded the hotels, which funded the convention center, and all of it depended on all of it, and none of it could fail without threatening everything else. The empire was magnificent, but it was built on debt and ambition, and the assumption that Houston would never stop growing and the future would never stop arriving. The collapse came faster than anyone expected. Judge Roy Hofheinz had built an empire, but empires require maintenance and cash flow and good health, and by 1970, he had run short of all three. On May 14th of that year, he suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. The man who had unlocked the gates early because he could not contain his excitement would never walk through AstroWorld the same way again. His body had failed him, but the finances were failing too. The national economy was souring, and interest rates were climbing, and all those leveraged projects that depended on each other started pulling each other down. Hofheinz consolidated everything under a single entity called Astrodomain Corporation. But consolidation could not solve the fundamental problem. There was too much debt and not enough revenue, and the creditors were circling. By 1974, AstroWorld was in negotiations with Six Flags Incorporated, a company based in Texas that had built its reputation on regional theme parks. The deal closed in May of 1975 when Six Flags signed a 20-year lease to operate the park. This was historic for reasons that had nothing to do with Houston. AstroWorld became the fourth property in the Six Flags family, but it was the first park the company had ever purchased rather than built from scratch. Every other Six Flags location had been conceived and constructed by the company itself. AstroWorld was an acquisition, an inheritance, someone else's dream that Six Flags was now responsible for maintaining. The transition could have been a disaster. New corporate owners often strip assets and cut costs and let the original vision decay into something generic and forgettable. But Six Flags did something unexpected. They invested, they expanded, they brought professional management and capital resources that Hofheinz, in his diminished state, could never have provided. The park that had been born from one man's oversized ambition was about to enter a new phase defined not by a single visionary, but by a corporation that understood how to build rides and draw crowds and turn a profit year after year. The Texas Cyclone was coming, and with it, a period that would establish AstroWorld as more than a regional attraction. The park was about to become a genuine pioneer in the amusement industry, and the innovations that emerged from that swampy land south of the Astrodome would influence theme parks around the world for decades to come. The Texas Cyclone opened on June 12, 1976, and it changed everything. The story of how it came to exist reveals something essential about AstroWorld in its Six Flags era. The original Cyclone at Coney Island in New York had been thrilling riders since 1927, but by the 1970s, it was falling apart. The wooden structure was deteriorating, and the city was considering demolition to make room for an expansion of the New York Aquarium. Bill Crandall, the general manager of AstroWorld, saw an opportunity. He attempted to purchase the entire roller coaster and move it piece by piece to Houston. The plan fell through when engineers determined that relocation would be prohibitively expensive and the old wood might not survive the journey. So Crandall and his team decided to do something better. They hired designers Don Rosser and William Cobb to study the Coney Island Cyclone, and then build a version that was taller and faster and meaner. The Frontier Construction Company manufactured the result: 93 feet tall, 3,180 feet of track, a ride time of 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The first drop came at you at an angle that made your stomach lurch, and the air time on the hills was legendary. You floated out of your seat again and again, and the wooden structure groaned and rattled beneath you in a way that steel coasters could never replicate. That same year, a roller coaster historian named Robert Cartmel declared the Texas Cyclone the best roller coaster in the world. Not in Texas, not in the South, in the world. For children growing up in Houston, that white wooden structure visible from Loop 610 became a landmark as familiar as the Astrodome itself. You saw it from the highway, and you begged your parents to take you, and when you finally rode it, you talked about it at school on Monday, and your friends who had not yet experienced it looked at you with envy and longing. The Texas Cyclone was not the only innovation emerging from that swampy land. In 1980, AstroWorld debuted Thunder River, a rapids ride that sent circular boats through churning water and simulated the experience of whitewater rafting. Bill Crandall had conceived the idea after watching coverage of the 1972 Munich Olympics, where kayaking events captured his imagination. No theme park had ever built anything like it. Thunder River was the first river rapids ride in the world, and it was born in Houston. The popularity was immediate and overwhelming. Six Flags installed similar rides at their other parks throughout the 1980s, and competitors rushed to build their own versions. AstroWorld was no longer just a regional attraction where Houston families spent summer afternoons. It had become a laboratory where the future of the amusement industry was being invented. The corporate history of AstroWorld reads like a game of hot potato played with hundreds of millions of dollars. When Six Flags took over operations in 1975, the company was a relatively straightforward regional operator based in Texas. But the American amusement industry was consolidating, and Six Flags became a target for larger players seeking entertainment assets. In 1987, the Bally Corporation sold Six Flags to Wesray Capital Corporation for $610 million. Wesray was a private equity firm interested in returns, not roller coasters. 3 years later, Time Warner began acquiring the Six Flags parks in a process that stretched across 4 years as the media conglomerate assembled an entertainment portfolio that included everything from magazines to movie studios to theme parks. Then, in 1998, everything changed again. A company called Premier Parks purchased the entirety of Six Flags from Time Warner for $1.86 billion. Premier was an aggressive acquirer led by executives who believed that scale was everything. Over 4 years, they purchased 31 amusement parks, including all 12 Six Flags properties. The company's leader received a $2 million bonus just for completing the Six Flags acquisition. The strategy was growth through debt. Buy parks with borrowed money and assume that increased attendance and operational efficiency would generate enough cash to service the loans. It did not work. Six Flags failed to turn a profit for 5 consecutive years after the 1998 acquisition. In the first half of 2003 alone, the company announced losses of $122 million. The theme parks themselves were not necessarily failing. Families still came. Children still screamed on the Texas Cyclone. The funnel cake stand still sold fried dough covered in powdered sugar. But the corporate structure above was rotting. Each ownership change brought new executives with new priorities and shorter time horizons. Investment in maintenance and new attractions became harder to justify when the parent company was bleeding money and creditors were demanding repayment. Judge Roy Hofheinz had died in 1982, a decade before the worst of the corporate turbulence began. He never saw what happened to his creation as it passed from hand to hand, each new owner more distant from Houston, each new spreadsheet treating the park as an asset to be optimized rather than a place where children discovered wonder. The visitors walking through the gates in 2003 had no idea that their park had become a liability on a balance sheet reviewed by executives who had probably never eaten a Fletcher's corny dog or felt the Texas Cyclone rattle beneath them. If you grew up in Houston between 1970 and 2005, there is a good chance that some of your most vivid childhood memories took place on 57 acres of reclaimed swampland south of the Astrodome. The experience began before you even arrived. Driving south on Loop 610 with your family or your school group or your church youth organization, you would see it rising from the flat Texas landscape. The white wooden lattice of the Texas Cyclone visible above the trees, the screams of riders carrying across the highway and mixing with the noise of traffic. Your heart would start beating faster while you were still in the car because you knew what was coming. For 37 years, AstroWorld was the playground for millions of Houstonians and families from around the world. The rides had names that became part of the local vocabulary: the Viper, Batman, the Escape, the Texas Tornado, Greased Lightning, which launched you from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4 seconds flat, XLR8, which hung you beneath the track and sent your legs dangling over the void. People who worked there accumulated stories that sound almost fictional now. Media events at 5 in the morning where journalists rode roller coasters before the park opened. A Wheel of Fortune tapings that brought television cameras to Houston. Concerts at the Southern Star Amphitheater where you could see the Grateful Dead, or Bob Dylan, or Selena before her death made her a legend. Ringo Starr performed there, and his writer specified that he wanted only green M&Ms, which someone had to sort by hand. Destiny's Child did a photo shoot for Ebony magazine in the Coney Island section near the Texas Cyclone, back when Beyoncé was still just one member of a group that was about to break out. The park hosted children's charity events and corporate gatherings and school field trips that rewarded good grades or perfect attendance. One former visitor remembers going when he was 10 years old and describes those as the best days of his life. Another recalls the field trips and rattles off ride names like a prayer. The Texas Cyclone, Greased Lightning. It was beyond fun. There was a texture to AstroWorld that distinguished it from cleaner and more corporate parks. Season ticket prices were cheap enough that parents sometimes used the place as unofficial daycare, dropping their teenagers off in the morning and picking them up at night. This accessibility created problems. Gang activity increased to the point where the park installed metal detectors at the entrance, a security measure that seems routine today but was virtually unprecedented for an amusement park at the time. The place was a bit rough around the edges, grimy in ways that Six Flags Over Texas or Disney properties would never tolerate. But Houstonians embraced that grit as part of the identity. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. Adults who visited felt childhood wonder return even as they noticed the paint peeling in places and the lines getting longer because rides were breaking down more often. There was an air of classic Americana mixed with the particular quirks of Texas, a combination that could not be replicated anywhere else because it had grown organically from this specific soil and this specific city and the specific people who returned year after year until returning became ritual, and ritual became memory, and memory became the thing that would hurt so much when the gates finally closed. The forces that would eventually kill AstroWorld did not arrive all at once. They accumulated over decades, each one survivable on its own, together, forming a weight that no theme park could carry indefinitely. The first major blow came on July 29, 1983, when the Texas Cyclone became the site of a tragedy that haunted the park for years. A new train was being added to the roller coaster to increase capacity during the busy summer season. This process required moving a section of track called the transfer track and manually repositioning trains between a storage area and the main circuit. Something went wrong. A manager forgot to move a train back to its proper running position. Employees loaded onto the train for a test run, and instead of following the normal course, the cars veered off toward the end of the work track and crashed into the storage house. One park employee died. Several others were injured. The Texas Cyclone reopened, but the accident left a scar on the park's safety record and reminded everyone that the machinery of joy could also be machinery of death. The park absorbed this blow and continued operating for another 22 years. Then came September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks did not touch Houston directly, but they transformed American behavior in ways that rippled through every industry dependent on leisure and travel. People stayed home. Families canceled vacations. Theme park attendance dropped nationwide, and AstroWorld felt the decline acutely. The park had already been struggling with perceptions that it was outdated and run down. Complaints about crime in the surrounding area made some families choose other destinations. And the aging infrastructure required investment that the debt-burdened corporate parent was reluctant to provide. Attendance that had once exceeded 2 million visitors annually began sliding downward, and the slide accelerated after the attacks. The final blow involved something as mundane as parking. When the Houston Texans football team arrived in 2002, they brought with them a new stadium called Reliant Stadium, built adjacent to the Astrodome and the land where AstroWorld operated. The Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo was expanding as well, and suddenly, multiple major attractions were competing for the same finite parking infrastructure. For years, AstroWorld visitors had parked at the stadium complex under a contractual agreement with the facility operators. That agreement expired in August 2005, and negotiations to extend it collapsed. Six Flags Chief Financial Officer Jim Danhauser would later cite the expired parking arrangement as a contributing factor in the decision to close. Without reliable parking, the guest experience deteriorated. Families circled looking for spaces. The walk from car to gate grew longer and more frustrating. The simple act of arriving became an ordeal. Behind all these specific problems lurked a more fundamental calculation. The land beneath AstroWorld had become extraordinarily valuable. Houston was growing, and developers were hungry for acreage near the loop. Kieran Burke, the executive who oversaw the closure, later explained that the decision came down to condition and location and the costs to modernize. He and big offers were pouring in for the land, and it just made more sense to close. The villain in this story was not any single person or corporation. It was arithmetic. Rising land values on one side of the ledger, declining attendance, and deferred maintenance on the other. The numbers stopped working, and once the numbers stop working, everything else becomes rationalization. The death of AstroWorld was not a sudden execution. It was a slow starvation that anyone paying attention could see happening year after year. Six Flags stopped investing in the park long before they announced its closure. Major new attractions that might have drawn crowds and justified the operational costs simply never arrived. Other parks in the Six Flags chain received new roller coasters and themed areas, while AstroWorld made do with what it had. Worse than the absence of new rides was the gradual disappearance of old ones. The park began to feel like a repository for equipment that had outlived its usefulness elsewhere. Visitors noticed that rides would appear in Houston after spending years at other Six Flags properties, arriving worn and dated, the hand-me-downs of a corporate family that had decided which children mattered most. The theming that had distinguished AstroWorld in its early years eroded as the company shifted toward a philosophy of raw thrills over atmosphere. The original 8 themed sections that Randall Duell had designed gave way to a more generic layout where the goal was simply to pack in as many coasters as possible. But a thrill park only works if the thrills are genuinely thrilling, and AstroWorld never had the collection of world-class rides that might have justified abandoning its character. The removal of Excalibur struck longtime visitors as particularly symbolic. This was not just any ride. It was the first roller coaster completed when the park opened in 1968. It represented the original vision and the original promise. When Six Flags dismantled it, they severed the connection between generations. Parents who had ridden Excalibur as children could no longer share that specific experience with their own kids. The continuity of memory that keeps a regional park alive in the hearts of its community was broken. By the early 2000s, AstroWorld was operating on pure inertia. The staff members who returned each season could feel the decline in ways that visitors experiencing the park once or twice a year might miss. Paint that should have been refreshed went another season looking faded. Mechanical problems took longer to fix because replacement parts were harder to justify. The affected ride sat idle behind temporary barriers while families walked past wondering when they might reopen. Competition made everything worse. Six Flags Over Texas in Arlington and Fiesta Texas in San Antonio were receiving the investment that Houston was denied. Families with limited vacation budgets began choosing those destinations instead. Why drive to a park that felt neglected when you could drive a similar distance to one that felt alive? And the attendance figures reflected these choices, and the declining attendance justified further cuts in a cycle that could only end one way. Everyone who worked there knew something was coming. The only question was when. On September 12, 2005, 6 weeks before the end, Six Flags Chief Executive Kieran Burke announced that AstroWorld would close permanently at the conclusion of the current season. There would be no final summer, no farewell year where families could make one last pilgrimage and ride every ride and take photographs in front of the Texas Cyclone. The decision had already been made in boardrooms far from Houston, and the announcement was simply notification that the execution date had been set. The park would cease operations on October 30th, 2005. Demolition would begin the following day. The cruelty of the timeline cannot be overstated. Families who had visited AstroWorld in August of that year, thinking it was just another summer trip, had unknowingly experienced their last ride on greased lightning, or their last walk through the Coney Island section. The memories they made carried no special weight at the time, because they had no reason to believe those memories needed to be preserved. The goodbye was stolen from them by a corporate calendar that prioritized clean quarterly reports over human sentiment. Six Flags executives justified the closure with financial projections that would later prove embarrassingly optimistic. They expected to receive upwards of $150 million for the real estate. The land was valuable, and developers were hungry, and surely the sale would generate enough cash to justify abandoning 37 years of Houston history. The arithmetic looked compelling on spreadsheets reviewed in offices where no one had ever felt the Texas Cyclone rattle beneath them. The final weeks of operation had an atmosphere of disbelief. The park continued running its annual Fright Fest Halloween event because the schedule had been set months earlier and there was no reason to cancel. Visitors walked through crowds of employees dressed in monster costumes, knowing that these workers would soon be unemployed, and this elaborately decorated landscape would soon be rubble. One visitor who attended during those final days described riding a few times early in the morning, but spending most of the afternoon simply walking around and watching people. The employees looked lost in their costumes, performing roles that had suddenly become absurd. October 30th, 2005 became a day of unofficial citywide mourning. Houstonians who had not visited the park in years showed up to pay respects. The lines were long, but nobody complained, because complaining felt petty in the face of permanent loss. When the gates closed for the final time that night, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of something being taken. The demolition crews arrived the next morning. Six Flags had to spend $20 million to tear down the park and clear the land. An expense that further eroded the financial logic of the closure. Most of the rides and equipment were liquidated in a 3-day auction where collectors and enthusiasts bid on pieces of their childhood. The Texas Cyclone was dismantled and sold for scrap and souvenirs. One longtime visitor named Berryman purchased a piece of the track and support wood, physical evidence that the thing he loved had actually existed. When the final accounting was complete, Six Flags discovered that their projections had been fantasy. Instead of $150 million, they received $77 million for the land. After subtracting the $20 million in demolition costs, the net proceeds barely covered the debt they had hoped to eliminate. They had destroyed something irreplaceable and received in return less than half of what they expected. The arithmetic that had justified the closure turned out to be wrong, but by then, the Texas Cyclone was splinters and the memories were all that remained. The rides scattered like refugees after the closure. Greased Lightning, the steel shuttle coaster that had launched riders from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4 seconds, was disassembled and shipped to Lubbock, where it found a second life at a smaller park. The Mayan Mindbender ended up in Amarillo at Wonderland Park, where it has operated as the Hornet since 2009. These transplanted machines carry no plaques explaining their origins. Children who ride them today have no idea they are experiencing equipment that once thrilled families in Houston, artifacts of a place that exists now only in memory and photographs. The Texas Cyclone could not be saved. Moving a wooden roller coaster is not like moving a steel one. The structure was too large and too fragile, and the cost of relocation was prohibitive. On March 9, 2006, crews demolished the coaster that Robert Cartmel had once called the best in the world. The trains were liquidated at auction and shipped to La Ronde, a Six Flags park in Montreal, where they continued operating on a different track in a different country. A small section of the original wooden track was preserved and sent to the National Roller Coaster Museum in Texas, a fragment of history housed in a building that most people will never visit. What replaced AstroWorld is almost too perfect a symbol of everything wrong with the decision to close it. The mixed-use development that Six Flags executives had imagined, the hotels and retail and residential towers that would supposedly justify destroying 37 years of memories, never materialized. The lucrative plans fell through the cracks one by one. Developers who had expressed interest moved on to other projects. The economy shifted. The demand that had seemed so certain evaporated. Today, the land where 9 roller coasters once operated holds thousands upon thousands of parking spaces. The Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo owns nearly 102 acres of the former AstroWorld property and uses it primarily for overflow parking during the annual event that runs for less than a month each year. For the other 11 months, the asphalt sits empty, baking in the Houston sun, a monument to miscalculation. One structure survives. The pedestrian bridge that once carried visitors across Loop 610 from the parking lot to the park entrance still stands. It connects nothing to nothing now. The park side leads to emptiness, and the parking side serves lots that existed before AstroWorld closed. Drivers passing beneath it on the highway might not even notice it anymore. But for those who remember what it meant to cross that bridge as a child, to feel the anticipation building with each step as the sounds and smells of the park grew closer, the structure is a ghost limb. You can still see it, but the body it belonged to is gone. Travis Scott was 13 years old when AstroWorld closed. He grew up in Missouri City, a suburb south of Houston, close enough that the park would have been part of the landscape of his childhood. When he titled his 2018 album AstroWorld, he was not making an obscure reference or appropriating someone else's nostalgia. He was mourning something he had personally lost. In interviews, he spoke about the closure in terms that transformed a corporate real estate decision into a theft from an entire generation. They took AstroWorld away from us in Houston. They tore it down to build more apartment space. The bitterness in those words reflects a wound that never fully healed. The album artwork makes the connection explicit. The cover features a giant golden sculpture of Scott's head with his mouth open wide enough to walk through, a direct tribute to the entrance of the Texas Cyclone, where visitors once passed through the gaping mouth of a cartoonish figure before boarding the coaster. The font used for the album title and promotional materials matches the typography from original AstroWorld signage and ticket stubs. Scott was not just naming his project after a defunct theme park. He was attempting to resurrect it through art, to give younger listeners a doorway into something they had never experienced. For 3 years, Scott produced a music festival in Houston that carried the AstroWorld name and attempted to recreate some of the childhood spirit of the original park. The festival brought carnival rides and elaborate staging to NRG Park, the same complex where AstroWorld once operated. Young people who had never walked through the real gates could experience a simulation of the wonder their parents remembered. The mayor of Houston appeared at one event and made a promise that generated headlines even though it was extremely vague. He suggested the city might bring another amusement theme park back. Nothing concrete has materialized, but the fact that such a promise could generate excitement reveals how deeply the loss still resonates. There is a generation of Houstonians now who know AstroWorld only as an album. They stream the songs and wear the merchandise and have no idea that the Texas Cyclone was a real roller coaster or that Thunder River was the first rapids ride ever built. The park has become mythology, which is perhaps the only form of immortality available to places that no longer exist. The pedestrian bridge still crosses Loop 610. It was built with supports wide enough to accommodate a monorail that Judge Roy Hofheinz imagined but never completed. During the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, people walk across it to reach the overflow parking lots that cover the land where 9 roller coasters once stood. Most of them have no idea what they are crossing. They do not know that beneath their feet is the last surviving structure from a place where millions of children screamed with joy for 37 years. The bridge connects nothing to nothing now, but it still stands, and perhaps that is enough. The memory persists even when the place is gone. The song plays on even when the carousel has stopped turning.